He leaned closer, glass in hand, and whispered, "You were just a backup plan." I didn't flinch. Instead, I topped off his wine. Cabernet. Napa. The same bottle from our first anniversary. The same smug smile on his lips. But this time, I wasn't the woman he thought I still was. The candles on the table flickered. The salmon was overcooked. But neither of us said a word. 10 years, one house, a dozen holidays. And suddenly, I was easy. His words didn't echo. They carved. I had spent 3 days preparing this dinner. Set the table with our wedding china. Polished the silver. Even wore the necklace he gave me on our 5th. A gift I now knew he'd ordered with a discount code. Across the table, his eyes sparkled like he'd finally said something clever. Something honest. I kept mine steady. Let the silence stretch. The kind that makes a man squirm. He didn't squirm. I glanced at the doorway. Ellie was upstairs. Doing homework. Or texting someone who probably made her laugh. She had no idea her father had just unzipped the truth. The truth. I'd seen it weeks ago. In an email thread between him and her. The woman who said no 10 years ago. The woman who had finally divorced. His words burned back then too. She was always the real thing. Olivia was safe. I was the mortgage partner. The carpool driver. The woman who held his mother's hand in hospice while he flew to Denver. For work. But tonight, he didn't know what I already knew. That the accounts were no longer shared. That the deed was no longer his. That the smile on my face wasn't not a V. It was loaded. His fork clinked against porcelain. "I thought we were past the hard stuff," he muttered. I nodded. "We are." The wine was full-bodied. So was the silence. If you heard those words, if the man you trusted whispered them into candlelight, would you pour the wine, or throw the glass? Where are you listening from? Has someone ever made you feel replaceable? Every Friday, I set the coffee maker the night before. Hazelnut blend. Michael liked waking up to the smell. Said it made the house feel lived in. Back then, I thought it was sweet. Now I wonder if he meant it smelled like I belonged more than he did. Our mornings followed a routine. I'd toast an English muffin. He'd scroll headlines while sipping coffee in the recliner. I'd check my email, then Ellie's lunchbox. Michael would remind her to take her geometry book. Then kiss my cheek, barely, and head out. It was choreography. Precise. Predictable. Safe. I used to love safe. After my first marriage imploded, safe felt like oxygen. Mark had cheated too, but loudly, cruelly. I promised myself I'd never fall for another illusion. But Michael wasn't loud. He was gentle, attentive, patient. He folded towels. He remembered birthdays. He called Ellie, "Kiddo," and carried her to bed after movie nights. He brought me soup when I got bronchitis. I mistook competence for love. 3 years after we met, we married. Small ceremony. Just close family. Ellie wore a pale blue dress and read a poem she wrote. I cried during her speech more than during the vows. Michael held my hand, firm but not tight, like he was already calculating the next move. We bought a house 6 months later, split everything 50-50. His name and mine, printed neatly on the deed. He insisted we use a joint account for all household expenses. "It builds trust," he said. I believed him. I gave up a promotion the next spring. The department chair had pulled me aside. Said the role was mine if I wanted it. But Ellie had just started middle school. Michael's hours had gotten longer. I told myself the job could wait. I wanted to be there for Ellie, even if she wasn't mine by blood. I wanted her to feel safe in a way I never had. So I stayed. I packed lunches. I drove carpools. I sat through every choir concert and orthodontist appointment. And Michael, he told his coworkers he was lucky. His wife handled everything. For a while, I believed him. until I noticed how he stopped introducing me at events. Stopped bringing me up in conversations with friends. Stopped asking how my day went, until the night I found him laughing in the garage. Alone. I thought he was on the phone with his brother. But it wasn't his brother. It was her. "I know," he said, voice low. "I can't believe she still thinks I'm in love with her." Then he laughed again. A sharp, careless sound that cut through the walls. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I just stood there, holding a half-empty bottle of detergent, watching a drip of bleach run across the tile. The next morning, he kissed my cheek like nothing had happened. Asked if we needed more eggs. I said no. Then wiped the counters twice, even though they were already clean. I wanted it to be a misunderstanding. I wanted to forget that laugh. That tone, that word, still. Like he'd been pretending the whole time, like I was the only one still playing house. That week, I started watching. Really watching. Who he texted at night. When he locked his phone. Why he suddenly bought cologne he'd never worn before. Why he left his wedding ring on the nightstand when he thought I wouldn't notice. He always noticed everything. Except me. I kept my questions quiet, my smile intact. I needed to be sure. Because if I was wrong, I'd burn everything good left in this house. But if I was right, then safe had never been real. And I had a different kind of rebuilding to do. It started with the cologne. A scent I didn't recognize. Sharper than the usual sandalwood he'd worn for years. It clung to his scarf one Tuesday night after a supposed client dinner, and it lingered, long after he showered. I opened the laundry room window and stared into the dark. The street lamp outside flickered. Somewhere, a dog barked once, then stopped. Inside, the washer buzzed softly. I ran my hand across Michael's coat, found a dry cleaning tag from a place we didn't use. Downtown, near his office. The collar smelled like vanilla and amber. Not detergent. I checked his phone. Of course it was locked now. Not the usual 4-digit code he'd used for years. Our anniversary date. Now it asked for Face ID. I laughed quietly. "When did you start hiding, Michael?" A few nights later, I found a receipt in the trash. Folded twice, wedged between a crumpled napkin and a protein bar wrapper. A dinner at Pine and Cedar. 2 entrees, 2 glasses of wine, tiramisu. The timestamp, Thursday, 7:42 p.m. He'd told me he worked late and grabbed takeout from the deli. I stared at the receipt until the ink blurred. We hadn't been to Pine and Cedar in 4 years. Not since our 7th anniversary. He said it was too noisy. Too expensive. Too young a crowd. But apparently, not too young for her. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I needed to know more. Not just for me, but for the woman he thought I still was. So I played the role. Good wife, quiet smile, steady hands. He'd walk in, hang his coat, kiss my cheek. I'd offer him tea. He never noticed I stopped brewing his favorite kind. Instead, I brewed mine. Chamomile. Bitter. Comforting. That weekend, I sat alone in the den with a glass of wine, scrolling through our joint credit card log. He was usually careful. But not careful enough. 2 Uber charges from the city, after midnight. A boutique florist receipt. A $210 payment at a lingerie store I'd never stepped foot in. I leaned back in my chair. The wood creaked under me. Ellie's laughter echoed faintly from upstairs. She was FaceTiming a friend, talking about science homework. I closed the laptop. Stared at my hands. They didn't shake. Not yet. On Monday, I took a longer lunch break. Drove downtown. Found the dry cleaner. I stood at the counter and asked, casually, if they could check the pickup record for Michael Barnes. The woman looked up, hesitated. Then smiled. "Oh, right. He picks up every other Wednesday," she said. "Usually drops off the silk stuff, you know, scarves, blouses, that kind of thing." She winked. "Lucky girlfriend." I nodded once. held my smile, then walked back to my car, closed the door, and exhaled slowly. Not a single silk item in our closet was mine. I skipped my next meeting. Parked by Green Lake and just sat there, engine off. The water shimmered in the wind. A couple jogged past, holding hands. I used to envy that. Now I pitied it. Because I knew the look, the gentle lean toward one another. The false safety. That night, Michael came home humming. Said his meeting ran late. I asked if he wanted leftovers. He kissed the top of my head. No thanks, I grabbed something with Matt. Matt, who had moved to Arizona last year. I didn't call him out. I didn't even blink. Instead, I watched him sit down on the couch, open his laptop, and disappear into whatever world he lived in now. I picked up my glass, walked to the window, and looked out over the neighborhood. Same houses. Same porch lights. Same illusion. But inside my chest, something had shifted. Like a hinge finally breaking. A quiet snap no one else could hear. That's when I knew. This wasn't a rough patch. This wasn't drifting apart. This was betrayal, slow, deliberate, hidden behind routine. And I was done pretending I didn't see it. The night it cracked was a Thursday. Ellie had a sleepover at Jasmine's. No school the next day. Michael texted at 7:26. Running late, presentation ran over. Love you. I'd stared at that message longer than I should have. The words were perfect. Polished. The kind you send when you want to seem invested, but your mind is elsewhere. At 8:43, the garage door rolled open. He walked in with a breezy, "Hey, babe." No tie. No briefcase. Just his keys jangling and that navy coat that still held a scent that wasn't mine. I stood at the kitchen sink, candle lit. Glass of Chardonnay half empty. I'd set 2 plates on the table. Still warm under foil. He didn't notice. He kissed my cheek like someone greeting an acquaintance. Quick. Detached. His breath carried gin and something sweet. Not my perfume. Not anything I owned. How was the presentation? I asked. Dragged on. Vendor wouldn't shut up, he said, reaching for a Pellegrino. He didn't look me in the eye. Mind if I crash early? That's when I knew. He wanted to disappear before I could ask anything real. Before my eyes peeled back the script. I dried my hands on the dish towel. Actually, I said, I have something to show you. He froze, just for a second. Then turned casual to casual. Yeah. What's up? I walked to the side drawer and pulled out the manila folder. Simple, plain, quiet. I slid it across the island. Open it. He didn't touch it. Not right away. Just stared. Then exhaled slowly and smiled. That thin, diplomatic smile he used on contractors and people who delivered bad news. What is it? You'll recognize it. Still, he didn't open it. Instead, he stepped closer. Put one hand on the folder like it might combust. You've been checking on me. His tone wasn't surprise. It was warning. I folded my arms. I've been watching. There's a difference. He shook his head. Low chuckle. Liv, come on. Are we really doing this? You've gone through my stuff now. I went through our statements. Our shared cards. Our house. I found what was already there. His jaw flexed. You think a few receipts mean anything? I leaned forward, voice calm. I know about Pine and Cedar. About the boutique off Fifth. About the dry cleaner near your office. About the wine bar in Capitol Hill you said you hated. And the Uber rides past midnight. He opened the folder. Flipped past the receipts, the screenshots, the time-stamped photos. Then came the picture. Him walking out of the boutique, bag in hand. And reflected in the car door beside him, a woman. Tall, hair curled. Not me. He paused. Let out a breath. Didn't speak. Finally, he muttered, "This is insane." I said nothing. You've been collecting things behind my back. He added. Still deflecting. still pretending the issue was my awareness, not his betrayal. I had to, I replied, voice steady. Because if I didn't trust myself, I would have kept trusting you. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. Look, things have been tense. We've both been off. Maybe we just need a break. A break. From what? Being your emotional placeholder. You lied, I said. Repeatedly. You looked me in the face and chose the lie. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Drank the rest of his Pellegrino. Then set the glass down harder than he needed to. I didn't sleep with her, he snapped. That wasn't the defense he thought it was. I didn't even blink. You didn't have to. I walked around the island, stood 3 feet from him. It was never about sex. It was the lies, the planning, the fact that I was always a placeholder for someone else. He looked away. She said no. Didn't she? I asked. Quiet, cold. That was the moment. He didn't answer. He just stared at the sink like it might answer for him. You think I didn't know? I whispered. You talk in your sleep sometimes? He turned back, startled. I've heard her name. More than once. He stepped back like I'd hit him. The air between us changed. Thick with the weight of everything unspoken. Everything I had absorbed over years of pretending this marriage was more than maintenance. Finally, he said, "What do you want?" That question told me everything. It meant, what do you want from me to keep this quiet? To let me keep the image intact? I want the truth, I replied. For once. He didn't give it. He turned and walked upstairs. Not a single backward glance. I sat down at the table alone. Forked through cold salmon. The candle burned lower. And I realized this was the quiet before rebuilding. This was the stillness of a woman being erased. Right before she rewrites everything. That night, I didn't sleep in our bed. I lay on the couch wrapped in the old throw blanket Ellie loved when she was small. I stared at the ceiling fan as it turned, slow and steady. Like time itself didn't care that something had broken in me. At dawn, I brewed coffee for one. Watched the sun stretch across the kitchen tiles. And I realized this house no longer felt like mine. That weekend, while they were at the movies, I opened the guest room closet, pulled down the storage bin I hadn't touched in years. Inside, papers I'd once thought I'd never need. Old accounts. Certificates. A notarized copy of our deed. My name was listed first. For the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe. And beneath the wreckage of what I thought we had, I found the start of something solid: resolve. I stopped setting the coffee timer. For 10 years, every evening before bed, I'd fill the reservoir, measure the grounds, and press. Delay brew. So he'd wake up to hazelnut warmth. Now the machine stayed cold. I listened to him fumble with it each morning, mumble something under his breath, then give up. And I let him. That silence tasted better than the coffee ever did. He never asked why. Never mentioned the folder again. Never explained anything. Instead, he buried himself in calls. In deadlines. In games of pretend that I no longer had the energy to join. I still cooked dinner. I still folded his laundry. I still greeted Ellie with a smile after school and asked about her tests. But none of it felt real anymore. I was performing a life that had already ended. Only no one had declared it dead. One night, I stayed late at my desk. The college was quiet. Even the janitor had left. I stared at my screen. Budget numbers, enrollment figures, until the numbers blurred. Then I stared past them, at the reflection in my monitor. I looked tired. Pale. Older than I remembered. Not in the lines around my eyes, but in something deeper. Like part of me had gone missing when I wasn't looking. Like I'd handed it over in small pieces. One PTA meeting, one missed opportunity, one, "don't worry, I've got it," at a time. When I got home, the house was dim. Michael was upstairs. I walked through the rooms like a guest. Kitchen, spotless. Dining table, bare. A single wine glass drying on the rack, mine. In the bedroom, his things were where they always were. His side of the closet. His slippers just so under the bed. His nightstand drawer, still slightly ajar. I sat at the edge of the mattress and opened it fully. A watch. Receipts. A USB stick. My hand hovered over it, then pulled back. I wasn't ready. Not yet. I lay back against the pillows. Stared at the ceiling fan. I used to count its turns when I couldn't sleep. It used to calm me. Now, it just reminded me that everything kept moving whether I healed or not. The next day, I wore lipstick to work. Red, the one he once called too bold. No one commented, but a student assistant smiled at me and said, "You look strong today." And that stayed with me longer than it should have. At home, dinner was quiet. Michael talked about budget cuts. Ellie talked about jazz band. I smiled, nodded, laughed in the right places. But my hands stayed clenched under the table. After dinner, I washed dishes alone. I stared at the suds, the bubbles popping soundlessly. And I whispered, "Why wasn't I enough?" Not loud, just enough for the faucet to hear. That night, I found myself staring at the family photo on the hallway wall. It was from 3 years ago. Michael, Ellie and me. We were all laughing. I couldn't remember what was funny. I only remembered how tightly he held my waist in that shot, how safe I'd felt. I reached up and took the frame off the hook, held it in my hands, felt its weight. Then, carefully, I turned it over and slid the photo out. It came out smoothly. Too smoothly. Behind it, tucked in the frame, was another picture, not visible from the front. A photo booth strip, Michael and her. Laughing. Shoulders touching. His face pressed to hers. My stomach turned. I slid the photo back in. Put the frame down, face down, and walked away. In the guest room, I sat on the floor, legs folded, back to the wall. For the first time since all of this began, I cried. Not the broken sobs of someone blindsided, but the quiet, steady grief of someone who finally stopped pretending. I cried for the dinners I made while he lied, for the nights I stayed up worrying about Ellie's test scores while he texted someone else. For the years I put myself second, third, last, for the woman I used to be. Before I believed love had to mean sacrifice. I cried until the tears ran dry. Until my hands stopped shaking, until the air felt still again. Then I stood, washed my face, and folded the throw blanket at the edge of the bed. Something had shifted. Not anger. Not yet. But a clarity. A knowing. He thought I'd stay. He thought I'd accept just enough to keep the illusion intact, but he didn't know me anymore. I had let myself forget too. But not for much longer. I didn't change overnight. There was no grand speech, no slammed door, no broken glass, just a quiet shift. The kind that starts in your spine. The kind only you can feel. Until one day, the whole room does too. It began with a list. I sat at the kitchen table one evening while Michael and Ellie watched TV in the living room. I pulled out a legal pad from the junk drawer. The same drawer where we kept batteries and pens that barely worked. And I wrote, deeds, copy, guest room, bind, joint accounts, call bank, passwords, change everything, lawyer. Check retainer from 2017. Each line came slower than the last, like my hand was hesitant, but my body already knew. I tucked the list between pages of an old cookbook. He never cooked. He'd never find it. The next morning I left the house early. Said I had a staff meeting. Instead, I parked 2 blocks from the college and made 3 calls. The first, to a lawyer I'd met years ago when I did budgeting for faculty divorce settlements. The second, to the bank manager I knew from our neighborhood branch. The third, to myself, sitting in the car, palms sweating, telling myself I could do this. The lawyer's name was Janice Wu. Sharp. Quiet. The kind of woman who listened more than she spoke. When I sat down in her office, she offered tea. I declined. "I'm not here for drama," I told her. "I'm here for clarity." Janice nodded once. "That's usually the sign you're ready." We went over the basics. Property, accounts, Ellie. Even though Ellie wasn't mine legally, Janice paused. "Have you raised her?" she asked. "Since she was 2, I said. "She calls me Mom. But I never adopted her." Her expression softened, just slightly. "Then we'll factor that in. Not legally, but humanly." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to me in weeks. I left her office with a folder full of paperwork and a checklist. Not for revenge, for protection. The bank meeting was quicker. I had my own account again by noon. Transferred half of the liquid funds from our joint savings. Left a note in the memo line. Pair household agreement. He wouldn't notice. Not yet. That night, I made spaghetti. Ellie grated the cheese. Michael scrolled through his phone while the garlic bread burned slightly. At dinner, he talked about an upcoming retreat. 3 nights in Portland. All executives, no spouses. I nodded. Twirled my fork. Said, "Sounds productive." I didn't ask who else would be there. He didn't offer it. But the way he looked down after saying, "No spouses," told me enough. Later, while he showered, I opened his laptop. He'd left it on the guest bed. His password had changed. Again. But I noticed the keychain sitting beside it. His USB. The one I'd seen in the nightstand drawer. I plugged it in. It took 10 seconds to load. Then, folders, hundreds of them. Work reports, personal backups, a folder named 2000 Hotter San Francisco, and then one marked private. It was locked. I didn't try to guess the password. Not yet. I copied it all to my drive. Unplugged. Put everything back. I moved through the days like water. Silent, present, impossible to grasp. At work, I said yes to a project that took me off campus more. At home, I cleaned out the office. Told Michael I was reorganizing. I shredded old papers, made room for new ones. Found a lease agreement from the house he lived in with his first wife. Not filed, not labeled. Just tucked away. I stared at her name for a long time. So many things began before me. And so many had nothing to do with love. One night, Michael fell asleep early. Ellie was at a school event. I walked into the master bathroom, opened the drawer where he kept his shaving kit. Inside, a receipt from a jewelry store. 3 weeks old. A handwritten note stapled to it. Exchange for different chain. Her neck is smaller. I sat on the closed toilet lid, holding the paper like it might crumble. He hadn't bought me jewelry in 2 years. The chain he was exchanging was never meant for me. I folded the receipt and slipped it into a new folder. My own. Labeled. Truth. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake and thought about how many ways a woman can be erased. Not with violence. But with absence. With, forgot to mention. With, it's not what it looks like. With passwords changed. With names not said out loud. And I thought, if I let this continue, I'm not just being erased. I'm agreeing to it. So I stopped agreeing. I changed my email password, unlinked his devices from my cloud. Booked a consultation with a forensic accountant, just in case. When the woman called back, she had a warm voice. "Most women who call me don't think they're allowed to," she said gently. I didn't reply. But my throat tightened. At dinner, Michael asked if I was okay. "You've been quiet lately," he said, almost amused. I smiled. "I'm just focused. That's all." He nodded. Told me I looked good with my hair up. Then went back to his phone. He didn't see the line that had already been drawn, not between us, but around me. A quiet perimeter, of dignity, of preparation, of control slowly reclaimed, paper by paper, breath by breath. If you've ever had to protect yourself in silence, tell me below. Was it justice or just survival? Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more true stories of quiet empowerment and healing. I chose the dining room, not the living room with its soft lamps and throw pillows. Not the bedroom with its false intimacy. And definitely not the kitchen. Too many memories clinging to the cabinets. The dining room had always been formal, neutral. A place where things were said with silverware in hand and linen napkins folded just so. It was also the only room with a wall large enough for a projector screen. I measured this space on a Tuesday morning. Michael was out. Team strategy meeting. Ellie was at school. By noon, I had a tech consultant scheduled. By Thursday, the screen was installed, disguised behind a fox painting I picked up from a home staging warehouse. No one would suspect. Not until I wanted them to. I made lists, double-checked them, tested the USB, it worked. Then I sent the invitations. A quiet dinner. Family only. Michael's mother. His brother. 2 of his cousins from Tacoma. Ellie, of course. All under the pretense of celebrating Michael's promotion. A title he'd claimed without confirmation. I let him have that fiction. For now, he smiled when I brought it up. You're doing all this for me? His eyes crinkled with pride. I smiled back. You deserve it. That week, I cooked more than usual. Roast chicken, pecan pie, fresh bread. I let him feel safe. Let him lean back into the illusion of his well-crafted life. At night, when he snored softly beside me, I lay awake rehearsing. Every line. Every breath. Not for drama, but for precision. I called Janice. Told her I wanted to initiate proceedings the morning after the dinner. We'll have the asset documents ready, she said. Do you want the filing to be public? Yes, I said. Public. Timed for 9 a.m. Janice paused. Do you want to send him the papers directly? I shook my head. No. I'll hand them to him myself. Friday came. I picked up flowers for the table. White tulips and lavender, simple but elegant. I polished the wine glasses, printed place cards in a quiet serif font. His mother liked formality. She never liked me much, but she respected detail. That night, I stood in front of the mirror and put on the navy silk dress I hadn't worn since our 7th anniversary. It still fit. A little looser at the waist, but I stood straighter now. Taller somehow. I wore the gold earrings Michael once said made me look too serious. That night, I needed to be serious. The guests arrived one by one. Ellie helped serve drinks. She didn't know what was coming. I didn't want her to carry this weight. Not yet. Michael beamed. He clinked glasses. He toasted himself in that charming, low-key way that made people laugh and lean in. When dessert plates were cleared, I tapped my spoon gently against my water glass. Thank you all for coming tonight. I began. Before we wrap up, I'd like to share something. Michael looked at me, puzzled, but not alarmed. I gave the nod to the tech. He stood quietly from the hallway, clicked the remote. The lights dimmed. The fox painting rolled upward, a screen descended. Michael's fork paused mid-air. Wet, he whispered. What is this? I turned to face the guests. For a second, the silence was absolute. Then the footage began, no narration, just the raw clips, screenshots of messages, time-stamped Uber rides, security footage, him and her. In the parking lot. At the hotel. Smiling, his mother gasped. One cousin cursed under her breath. Ellie looked confused. Michael stood up. What the hell are you doing? I turned to him. This is your legacy, Michael. I just thought your family should know what they're celebrating. You're insane, he snapped. He reached for the remote, but the tech had already walked out. I trusted you, I said calm. I chose this family. I made it mine. And you turned me into a backup plan. He froze. You said she was your real future. I added. You just needed me to get there. Someone behind him whispered, Jesus. I stepped forward, opened my clutch, pulled out the envelope. These are divorce papers. Effective tomorrow. The accounts are frozen. The house is under my name. Ellie will stay with me until you're stable enough to explain this. He stared at the envelope. Didn't touch it. You can deny the affair, I continued. But you can't deny the math, the logins, the photos, your voice in those videos. The screen went black. Silence again. Then I added, I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done being invisible. I turned to Ellie. Her eyes were wide. I knelt beside her and said, soft enough only she could hear, I'm not leaving you. This isn't your fault. You're the best part of this house. She nodded, slowly. Gripped my hand. Michael said nothing, did nothing. I walked past him, past the stunned faces, into the kitchen. Poured myself a glass of water. My hand didn't shake. The screen was still warm when it rolled back up. The room, cold. No one moved. Michael stood frozen, mouth slightly open. Like words might still find their way out. But they didn't. He reached for a napkin and wiped at nothing. The silence around him was heavy. Not angry, not shocked, just tired. His mother stood first. She clutched the back of her chair like it grounded her. I don't understand, she said, barely above a whisper. Michael turned to her, desperate. Mum, it's not what it looked like. But she shook her head, once sharp. All this time, she asked. You let her raise your child, hold this house together, and you call that a backup? He stepped toward her, but she stepped back. She didn't speak again. Didn't need to. One of his cousins leaned in and said something under his breath. The other picked up her purse and left the room entirely. Their footsteps sounded louder than they should have. Each heel clicked like a final sentence. Michael turned back to me. I trusted you too, you know, he said. That made me laugh, quietly. Like steam hissing from a kettle. No, I said. You trusted I wouldn't fight back. He looked around the room like a drowning man searching for a dock. But no one threw him a rope. Even Ellie, still seated, still holding her glass of water, was watching him now with something colder than confusion. Recognition. He turned back toward the hallway, muttering something about getting some air. The screen door creaked open, then slammed shut. For a long minute, we all sat there, still. I reached for Ellie's hand. She didn't pull away. I'm sorry you had to see that, I said. But she shook her head. I needed to, she whispered. I kissed her forehead and said nothing more. One by one, the guests filtered out. No one asked questions. No one hugged me. But I saw it in their eyes. They didn't look through me anymore. They saw me. I stayed behind to clear the dishes. Refused help. Stacked the plates. Wiped the counter. Ran the dishwasher. One act of reclaiming at a time. By midnight, the house was quiet again. Michael didn't return. In the morning, I found him asleep in his car in the driveway. Engine off. Neck bent awkwardly. I didn't knock. Just walked past him with Ellie, handed her her backpack, and drove her to school. The divorce filing hit the system at 9:01 a.m., as promised. At 10:45 I received a call from his office. His assistant, polite, measured, would like to schedule an HR review regarding Mr. Barnes' recent conduct, she said. I believe you'll want to be present for part of it. I said I'd make time. By noon, 2 local papers had picked up the story. Not sensationalized, just noted. Regional finance executive faces scrutiny over internal misconduct. Family fallout. My name wasn't even mentioned. And yet, I was everywhere in that headline. The next few days passed in slow waves. Michael returned to the house briefly to pack a few things. He didn't speak. Didn't look me in the eye. I watched him from the stairs as he zipped the luggage. His movements slower than usual. Shoulders curled in. He stopped at the door. Turned. "She wasn't supposed to mean anything," he said. I didn't respond. He waited for a beat. Then left. The lock clicked shut, and I exhaled. Ellie asked if he was okay. I told her that he would be. But I didn't add that he needed to face it alone. Because he did. I spent that weekend restoring things that mattered. Opened the guest room windows. Reorganized files. Donated old coats to the shelter. Scrubbed the baseboards with lemon cleaner. Not because they needed it, but because I wanted the house to smell like fresh beginnings. Janice called on Monday. "The account transfers went through," she said. "And the statement from your PI confirms the paper trail. There's no contest." "Thank you," I said. "Do you feel better?" "No," I admitted. "But I feel clear." The difference mattered. I sat at the dining table that evening, alone, and lit one candle. No screen, no folder, no audience. Just me. And stillness. And something like relief. I opened a new journal. Wrote the date. Then one line. "I am not collateral damage." That night, Ellie curled up beside me on the couch. We watched an old baking show. She laughed when the sponge cake collapsed. I laughed too. Not forced. Not hollow. But real. When she fell asleep, I brushed the hair from her face. She stirred, then whispered, "I'm glad it's just us right now." And I realized. So was I. 3 months later, the tulips bloomed again. Late spring in Seattle always caught me off guard. The chill softened. The light lingered longer in the hallway. And the silence in the house no longer felt like absence. It felt like peace. I'd started leaving the windows open. Letting air move through the rooms we had once filled with pretense. Now the curtains danced for no one but themselves. And I let them. Ellie painted a fox in art class. Orange, wide-eyed, lopsided. She taped it to the fridge and said, "I made this for you." Then she added, almost shyly, "I know you always liked them. He did too, right?" I didn't answer at first. Then I said, "Yes. But I like that this one is just ours." She smiled, then skipped away, leaving her socks on the floor. And I didn't mind picking them up. The dining room still held echoes of that night, but they had faded into something quieter. Like dust settling in corners no one looked anymore. I replaced the chairs. Donated the tablecloth. Painted the far wall a soft pine green. Not to erase what happened, but to reclaim the space where I said enough. The house stayed mine. Legally, emotionally, spiritually. Michael didn't fight it. Didn't return. Didn't ask for time with Ellie. At first, that pierced like a blade. But later, it simply became one more truth I no longer needed to carry. Some nights Ellie would curl beside me on the couch, legs tucked under, her cheek against my arm. She didn't ask about him anymore. But sometimes she'd say things like, "I like how quiet it is now." Or, "I don't have to pretend at dinner." Children don't always need answers. Sometimes they just need to feel that you're listening. One night, she looked at me and whispered, "Were you scared?" I didn't lie. "Yes," I said. But I was more tired than scared. Her small fingers wrapped around mine. "You don't seem tired now." I kissed the top of her head. "That's because I stopped waiting for someone to choose me." She didn't speak after that. She didn't need to. That spring, I finally accepted the promotion. Full benefits, new office, new desk. The first thing I placed on it was a photo of Ellie and me at the lake. No filters, no fancy outfits. Just two windblown faces smiling into a future we were finally building on our own terms. Colleagues started seeing me differently. I saw it in the way they deferred to me in meetings. In how they listened when I spoke. It wasn't louder respect. It was deeper. At the faculty spring mixer, someone asked if I was bringing a guest. I smiled. No guest. Just me. And I said it without shame. Without apology. Without needing to fill the space beside me to feel whole. I began writing again. Not in a journal. But letters. To Ellie. One for her 16th birthday. One for her college acceptance. One for the day she falls in love. And one for the day she might find herself walking away. Each letter ended the same. You are not someone's second choice. You are your own first one. I placed them in a box in my closet. Labeled. For when the world tries to forget your worth. Because mine had, for a long time. Michael had called me a plan B. But in reality, I was the entire foundation. The builder. The glue. The caretaker of things no one else noticed until they broke. I learned how invisible love can feel when it isn't returned. How dangerous silence becomes when it's mistaken for peace. And how heavy a marriage can be when you're the only one holding it up. But I also learned this: you can rebuild without rage. You can heal without asking for permission. And you can walk out of a room without slamming a single door. And still never go back. One Sunday, I ran into his mother at the market, by the lemons. She looked thinner, older. But her voice was steady when she said, "I misjudged you. For years." She paused. "I'm sorry." I met her eyes. "I'm not," I replied. "Not anymore." At home, the air smelled like lemon cleaner and baked bread. Ellie was coloring at the table. The fox was still on the fridge. The dog we didn't have still lived in her imagination. Everything was quieter, but nothing felt empty. A week later, the final divorce confirmation arrived via email. Subject line finalized. No attachments. Just a date. And a legal code. I stared at it for a moment. Not because I didn't believe it. But because I finally did. I closed the laptop, lit a candle, chamomile and cedar, a scent I picked. For myself. And I sat down to write one last letter. To no one, to everyone. To the woman I was 3 years ago, stirring pasta while wondering where he was. To the woman who found a receipt in the trash and said nothing. To the woman who stood in a quiet dining room and said, "This ends here." The letter was short. "Hey, left the room thinking you'd chase him. You stayed, and the house became yours." If you've ever had to rebuild piece by piece, not to prove them wrong but to prove yourself right, share your story below. Was your piece quiet, or did it roar? You are not alone. Every ending can be a beginning. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more true stories of healing, quiet justice, and legacy after 40.